Well, it seems like people are still trickling in a little bit, but we can go ahead and start with the introductions. So welcome again to the first PILC panel of the official PILC week, Contraception and Consumption in the Age of Extinction. My name is Claire Money. I'm a 1L representative for PILC, and I'll be moderating this panel along with Lisa, who's also a representative for PILC. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a couple of tech-related comments. First of all, don't worry if you can't see yourself. This is a Zoom webinar, so all attendees are automatically muted with videos off, so you'll only be able to see the panelists. And throughout the panel, if you have any questions, please drop it in the Q&A function rather than the chat. All panelists will give their presentations, and then there will be some time for a Q&A at the end. So feel free to just drop questions in the Q&A throughout the presentation. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to the panelists to introduce themselves.
All right. Do you mind if we start and then I'll just give a brief introduction and then we'll introduce ourselves, Claire? Okay, great. So thank you all for joining us. My name is Kelly Dennings. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a campaigner with the Center for Biological Diversity. I have a bachelor's degree in natural resources and a master's in public health. And I started with the center in 2019, and I advocate for reproductive rights along with waste prevention as climate change and conservation solutions. And I want to acknowledge that I'm on former Seminole land. All right, so with me today are my co-panelists and co-workers, all from the center, and I'll turn it over to Adoma first to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Adoma Addo. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an environmental studies major with a concentration in global health at Yale University, and I'm an intern under Kelly. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Sarah?
Hi, and I'm Sarah Bailey. I'm an organizer at the Center for Biological Diversity. Been here for 4 years now. I am on former Winholdren land. And I'm also, like Kelly, interested in reproductive rights and how they connect with the environment. My background is in wildlife conservation, environmental education. I have masters in biology and public administration.
All right. So just a little bit about the center. It's a national nonprofit conservation organization with more than 1.7 million members and online activists. We work through a combination of science, the law, organizing, and creative media to protect wildlife and the wild places they need to thrive. On the screen, you're seeing all of our different programs. So we do a lot of stuff, and I recommend you check out our website if you're interested in any of this. So I just want to initially ground us with a few background slides. So there are nearly 8 billion people on the planet today, yet 50 years ago, there were half as many. And while human population has doubled, wildlife populations have plummeted by half. Perhaps you've heard about the UN report on biodiversity loss, that 1 million species are at risk of extinction in the coming decades due to human activity. So just how are people impacting species in the United States? Well, it's mostly from habitat destruction caused by agriculture, grazing, fossil fuel development, logging, urban sprawl, climate change, invasive species, and pollution. And while we have to stop using fossil fuels, transform what we eat, and hold polluting corporations accountable, we also have to alter our population growth and change our consumption if we're going to save room for other species to thrive. So even though the United States does have a low fertility rate, every child born here has an outsized impact on the planet. The US is just 5% of the world's population, but uses 30% of all resources and creates 30% of all waste. Purple and magenta countries here on this graph use more than 4 times the resources than yellow countries, and the average American has an environmental footprint 60% larger than most Europeans and nearly 700% larger than the average person in an African country. And only half of pregnancies in the United States are planned. So even though our fertility rate is not as high as those of other nations, we still have a lot of work to do to take full responsibility for our reproductive futures. So our philosophy is a win-win-win solution that empowers people, improves resilience and health outcomes, and reduces pressure on wildlife and the environment. When we talk about this, we take a human rights lens. It's done with justice and equity in mind, and we look to support people and the planet. But let's be clear, the center denounces any type of population control, coercion, ecofascism, genocide, eugenics, or closing of borders. So Project Drawdown lists education of women and girls and access to family planning as top climate change solutions. Women with more years of education have fewer and healthier children and actively manage their reproductive health. Educated girls realize higher wages and greater upward mobility. This is a great resource if you haven't seen this website. So, all right. So last year, the center conducted a survey to analyze the awareness, attitudes, behavioral intention, and norms around these topics. We surveyed 899 people across the United States for a 95% confidence interval. If you want further information about the statistical validity of the survey, please speak to me afterwards, shoot me an email. The survey had 16 questions about population consumption, wildlife, and 5 of them were from a previous survey that the center conducted in 2013. And we were really looking to see if things had changed over time. So I am just going to go over a portion of the results today. Please jump on our website to see the full report. So some narratives say that population growth is mainly responsible for the rapid loss of species biodiversity, while others say it's consumption. And the center focuses on both these topics, but we were interested in knowing what the general public thought. So from our survey, you can see that 60% see the issue as being both also. And of this 60%, 66% believe the world's population and the world's consumption is responsible. You can see from this chart that between 2013 and 2019, there was a 23% increase in those who think the world's population is growing too fast. And you can see from this graph that between 2013 and 2019, 13% more people agree that human population growth is driving other animal species to extinction. And in this kind of final set here, similar to the other ones, again, between 2013 and 2019, 13% more people agree that stabilizing population growth would help the environment. So it was great that we were seeing this change over time in attitudes in relationship to this. We took 4 questions and I kind of put them together on this slide here. So you see that around 70% of survey respondents somewhat agree or strongly agree that the world's population is growing too fast and it's driving other animals to extinction. And that same high percentage believe that stabilizing population growth would protect the environment. And if it's true, we have a moral responsibility to act. So we also looked at some demographic differences between responses. There was a lot of data that we could be analyzing. Of course, Democrats and Republicans do not compare equally on this issue. Democrats are more likely to strongly agree that human population growth is driving other animal species to extinction and that stabilizing population growth will help protect the environment. So we had a set of questions around climate change also. So, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change notes that population increases aggravate world growth of greenhouse gas emissions. The gap in per capita emissions between the highest and lowest emitting countries is vast, more than 50 times greater than the highest emitter. Global emissions could be reduced by an estimated 40% or more with slower population growth. Moving from the median to low UN fertility projections can result in 35% fewer annual emissions and 15% higher income per capita. So the survey showed that 71% of respondents somewhat or strongly agree that human population growth is making climate change worse. And this was a 14% increase over 2013 survey results. And when asked what the top benefit was to addressing US population growth, folks understand that it helps to lower greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change. And, you know, climate change is being cited by young people as a reason to have fewer children. And so we added a new question to the survey that we hadn't asked in 2013. Your agreement or disagreement with this sentence: climate change compels Americans to choose to have fewer children. 33% somewhat or strongly agree with this statement. And of course, as to be expected, there were again demographic differences on this question too. Younger people were more likely to agree that climate change compels Americans to have fewer children than the general population. Men agree more so than women, and the same is true for those in an urban area. Our survey, we asked respondents to rank what issue was most important to them. And from this slide, you can see that healthcare was the most important, critically important issue to them, with the climate crisis as a close second. So we also asked a series of questions around family planning. And our survey showed that an overwhelming majority, 80%, agree that all types of birth control should be legal, free, and easily accessible. However, as we work on these solutions, it's important to keep in mind reproductive health care is riddled with inequalities. The reproductive justice movement was founded by Black women calling for a new approach that recognizes the unique needs of women of color and understands reproductive freedom as a life or death issue. In the environmental movement, we must embrace those basic rights and support the struggle for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to have good health care and a safe environment. And this was shown in our survey here. Over 2/3 of respondents somewhat or strongly agree that immigrants, people of color, and other marginalized communities disproportionately lack access to healthcare. So not only did we want to learn what people thought, but we wanted to know what they were doing. And so this slide sums up 6 questions that were in the survey. We asked about advocating for federal and state contraceptive policy, and also local sex ed policy. So you can see here who said what they're currently doing, which behavior they're currently doing, who said that they're willing to do a behavior. Some of that, they said that they needed more information to do it, but they are willing to do it. And so for us, for the center, this really shows the intention behavior gap. And the center wants to build campaigns to help overcome these gaps. So we hope you join us in building some of those campaigns. But anyway, that was a very quick summary of a portion of this, again, large national survey. But now I'm going to turn it over to Adoma, who has some additional research results to share with you.
Thanks so much, Kelly. So I'm going to be talking about 2 different projects. The first one being a more external message testing survey, which sought to gather and record perspectives regarding word choice for population consumption and their implications on the environment. And the second one was more of an internal organizational scan of our colleagues and contacts of the center, considering how these different organizations discussed population. So both of these projects were founded in the questions: how do we talk about population in a way that is sensitive and grounded in choice as well as justice? And the question, what do people perceive as the consequences of population growth? On to the next slide, please. So the first survey I'm going to be talking about is the message testing survey, in which we surveyed 185 folks from conferences and college campuses, posing 7 multiple choice questions. And in this presentation, I'm going to give you some of the high level overviews of some of the answers. For question 1, we asked which words should be used to talk about the amount of people on the planet and how it impacts the environment. And as you can see, the most common term was overpopulation, followed by population pressure. Overpopulation is a term that is commonly used. However, it provokes controversy sometimes and has been associated in the past with some racist and anti-immigrant lines that go against many of the views of the center that Kelly laid out earlier on. So this result really informs us that we should include the phrase population pressure in our work and help others decrease the use of overpopulation. Future surveys could test additional phrases in the center style guide and help remove overpopulation as a choice. Next slide, please. This next question focuses on which topic comes to mind when considering how the amount of people on the planet harms the environment. And as you can see here, the most popular response was the consumption of resources, followed by climate change. Similar to what Kelly said, the top responses really validate our need to focus on both population and consumption. The relationship between the number of people on the planet and our use of resources seems to be really evident to the people we surveyed. The second highest response is really also useful to know because it shows that climate change is already something that people are considering with respect to the discussion of population. And this question in particular, I will come back to later on because it provides context for question 7. But for now, on to question 3. This question focused on which terms best describe the proposed solutions to our discussion of population growth. And these responses really favored reproductive rights and reproductive freedom in line with the center's current use of these terms. 13 responses suggested alternate answers, which included reproductive education, parental planning, and reproductive responsibility. This research really helped us inform a glossary that we created to consider how population solutions might be used and interpreted in different circles. Next question. Question 4 focused on how much do you think immigration affects the impact of population on the environment? When asked to indicate how much they thought that immigration affects the impact of population on the environment, as I said before, with 1 being not at all and 5 being a lot, the 2 most popular responses were 3 and 2. And this really suggests that the most common response was the middle response. And these results suggest that the majority of people would really resonate with the center's message, which is focused on increasing access to contraception and comprehensive sexuality education throughout the globe, while continuing to emphasize migration as a human right. Next question. This question really considered how, the goal of this question was to figure out if people thought the topic of population was taboo, stigmatized, or not at all an issue. And as you can see in the results, the largest proportion of people considered discussing population to not be a problem, with the second most common response being that discussing population is looked down upon. This research suggests that while people might be open to discussing population, it remains a highly sensitive topic, which requires obviously a highly sensitive discussion. Next question. Another significant component of this question was that 20% of respondents suggested an alternate answer, with the vast majority of people asserting that population is essential and needs to be brought up more, followed by some people saying that there was a flawed reception of the current discussion, being their social stigma, controversy, or some sort of racial difficulties in discussing it. Other key components of the responses outlined were that it's uncommon, or it might be complicated or difficult to navigate. And these results really suggest that we should focus on maintaining the sensitivity, as I mentioned before, in our discussion of population, while also trying to keep it accessible. For question 7, respondents were asked to choose between 6 pictures that represent an environmental impact associated with population pressure. And the goal of this question was to see if the terms chosen in question 2 that asked how people harm the environment matched what is depicted in the pictures. And the term classifications, as you can see here, being sprawl and habitat loss, et cetera, were all classified internally by our team. The top response for this question was the aerial shot of the city, which we interpreted as representing habitat loss, followed by the picture of the mall, which represented consumption and capitalism. The top response of habitat loss is particularly interesting in comparison to the results from question 2, in which habitat loss was the least selected response. So consistent with the findings from question 2, consumption still remained a really common answer. The bottom response in this question, as you can see, a picture of wildlife by R.J. Sangosti, that really presented an interesting set of questions. Given that climate change was the second most selected answer for question 2, this result suggests that we should really reevaluate how people associate the visual images of anthropogenic environmental pressure with the larger thematic concepts. On to the next slide. So while the message testing offered really useful information on how people receive the discussion of population, we also needed to investigate how population is discussed and presented by other groups. And that led us to the organizational scan, which involved conducting online research of around over 200 colleagues of the center and their respective organizations. And we noted how these different organizations discussed population, the terms that they used when discussing it, and the different areas of focus that they looked at when talking about population. And so these were divided into the fields that you can see on the slide. And so I'm going to be giving you a high-level overview of all of the themes that we found throughout this survey. First, beginning with overarching themes, population growth was the most commonly used term, followed by demographic trends, population pressure, population dynamics, and there were pretty consistent proposed solutions with respect to population, being sexual and reproductive health rights, gender equity and empowerment, youth advocacy, and comprehensive sexuality education. In terms of the type of organization, international organizations tended to focus more on gender empowerment as a solution, whereas domestic organizations were more concerned with the discussions of structural and racial inequalities that act as barriers to access reproductive health care. Onto a more smaller level focus of the different organizations, population organizations, as the name implies, really recognized population growth as an issue in terms of resource constraints, lack of reproductive rights, and the extinction crisis, The solutions they proposed were focused on voluntary family planning and education of women and girls in particular. Overall, these organizations tended to always mention population and always mention some sort of a reproductive health solution. However, on the other hand, climate change organizations, in terms of climate change organizations, some recognize population growth and consumption as key drivers of climate change. However, they tended to see population growth as a sort of inevitable form of growth in the human context. As a result, many of the solutions they proposed were more focused on adaptation, creating technologies that adapt to the impact of growing populations. And furthermore, sexual and reproductive health rights and reproductive justice were not as prominent as components of the solution. So overall, these organizations sometimes mention population and sometimes mention the solutions, sort of the halfway mark of all of the organizations. Next slide. Similar to the climate change organizations, conservation organizations that we surveyed tended to recognize population growth as an inevitable problem, and also tended to be slightly more problem-oriented in their discussion. Likewise, they rarely discuss solutions, but they also did have some of an emphasis on sustainable utilization of natural resources. Again, more focused on adaptation. Overall, they often mention population, but rarely mention any solutions. Finally, in terms of the health and family planning organizations, they rarely mentioned the larger issue of population growth, but considered several issues that are aggravated by rampant population growth. Such they had a focus on environmental health, chronic disease, respiratory illness, and of course, as the name implies, family planning organizations were all involved in supporting family planning from more of a human-centric perspective, such that they were focused on improving the lives of young people internationally, advocating for comprehensive sexuality education and gender empowerment. So overall, health and family planning organizations tended to rarely mention population, but always mention solutions. On to the next slide. So these organizations, we had a couple of contexts that didn't quite fit into these overarching larger categories. And so you can see here that the demographic research organizations were pretty open in the discussion of population and climate change, but they sort of similarly to the climate change organizations tended to consider population growth as inevitable, typically aligned with the discussion of the demographic transition. Environmental justice organizations were primarily considering reproductive justice and environmental contaminants, and some were more focused on consumption, addressing consumption over addressing family planning. And finally, educational organizations tended to focus exclusively on research regarding the sexual and reproductive health rights. Onto the final slide. So overall, from the research, we have noted that the main area of focus should be changing from downstream adaptation-focused policies to more upstream mitigation-focused policies, which involves bringing reproductive health work back into the discussion, as it's a really crucial component for solution-oriented mitigation strategies that ensure that the most vulnerable populations are included and empowered in climate action. Another key takeaway from this research is that acknowledging that population is just one piece of the puzzle. As Kelly mentioned before, our focus is on both population and consumption and the nexus between the two. So this all folds into a recurring theme in our work, which is reorienting the justice lens, considering how structural inequalities act as barriers to access to voluntary choice-based reproductive health services, which Sarah will get into a little bit more in her presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Adoma. So yeah, I will be covering, sort of we've been talking about how people in organizations are uncomfortable talking about population, and I'm going to be covering and getting into the details of why that is. So the first thing is kind of really breaking down why do some people not want to talk about population? And all these categories come from a great paper by Diane Kuhl that really gets into like the nitty gritty of the details of why. So the first one is population skepticism, with the idea that population density is beneficial. And this can be kind of problematic because denying it's an issue altogether or claiming population density is beneficial doesn't really help, because population density can potentially be preferred over sprawl, but with increased number of people in an area, it is going to probably result in more intense land use. Then there's population declinism, which is that population isn't an issue because growth rates are slowing, which is true that growth rates are slowing, but population growth is still happening. And there is a lot of room for improvement in terms of ensuring reproductive freedom for everyone. That there's population decomposing, which is only addressing the components of population pressures rather than population growth as a whole. So this just kind of breaks it up into so many small little parts without allowing for like as holistic solutions. And they sometimes aren't viable once they're scaled up. But I can see the appeal because breaking things down into smaller pieces does make it seem more manageable, which gets to population fatalism, which is that the problem is too big and complicated to even try to solve. But as with a lot of other environmental issues, if we took that approach, we wouldn't have much hope for anything. And then there's population shaming, which is that population work is inherently racist based on actions that have been taken in the name of population control. And out of this list, population shaming and population skepticism are probably the two most damaging because of how dismissive they are, and just overall making the work feeling morally untouchable. Next slide. So going back to the survey Kelly mentioned earlier, this is the reasons our respondents mentioned for preferring not to discuss population growth with others, with the most popular response being it's too complicated for me to confidently discuss, the political climate today making it challenging to discuss, and peers not appreciating the discussion, along with just importance, it being too personal, or concerns about other communities. So yeah, that just kind of gives more insight based on how individuals feel, since Adoma covered some of this reasoning behind different groups. So with that, I want to address, oh, sorry, next slide. I want to address how we can start to have more productive conversations in this area, especially when it comes to someone who's questioning this work or their comfort level in doing it. And a big part of that is realizing that population is about more than just numbers, it's about people. So we need to take an approach that's inclusive, like Adoma was mentioning earlier. And a lot of the concerns that come from population shaming, are valid and based on events that are more recent and closer to home than we realize. So overall with this is, I recommend taking an active listening approach. And that is making sure you're engaged with your conversation partner. And it's about listening really attentively before getting into thinking about your response. So you really want to process what they're saying, make sure you clarify and understand and summarize before you take the time to respond. I know so often if we are having a discussion with someone we disagree with, we are immediately focusing on a rebuttal rather than what they were saying, but to have really authentic and productive conversations to bring people into this work. Active listening is a really critical step. Next slide, please. And to get back to some of these specific examples of human rights injustices that population shaming is based on, so these are a series of screenshots of headlines. So there is China's one-child policy, which is probably one of the most well-known ones that come up in terms of population. So it is ended, but it has only been bumped up to a two-child policy at this point. So there's still not full reproductive freedom there. And while it did meet its goal of slowing population growth, there were a lot of downstream issues immediately and later on that included infanticide of baby girls, selective abortions, due to the cultural importance of having boys. And now there are skewed sex ratios that kind of have other implications for their society now. Then to the right of that one is about the birth control trials in Puerto Rico. And that was the first large scale study done on women in housing projects there. And there was no informed consent and there were no autopsies done on the women who died. So it's not the best example of a well thought out study and concern for the participants. There also have been forced sterilizations of Indigenous women in the United States as recently as the 60s and 70s, which it's often, sometimes it's easier for people to think of these injustices as being afar, overseas in other countries, but they happen more recently and they happen here. And along with that, there have also been, as recently as a few months ago, the forced hysterectomies of women in ICE detention centers. And also in recent decades, forced sterilization of people in US prisons. And everyone deserves reproductive autonomy. And sterilizations don't fix any of the systemic problems that they are trying to. Next slide. So now I'm going to get into how to correct some of these common pitfalls. So when we come across them in conversations, how we can better approach them. And I like this little illustration because it kind of is it does a good job illustrating how some of these conversations can go. So we've got to deal with the root cause of global warming. Right, let's talk sustainability. Let's talk clean energy, sustainable agriculture, carbon footprints. Actually, how about we talk about sustainable human population? Sorry, we don't talk about that. So that's population declinism or denial altogether. Next slide. So the first step is, as has been addressed by both Kelly and Adoma, is that population pressure involves consumption and the number of people. So we want to correct people's thinking that the issue is only one or the other. So whether that means any claims of focusing on the right number of people, whether that be per an individual family or for the planet as a whole, or any kind of ideal fertility rate. There's so many things that go into that in terms of levels of consumption that we don't focus on crunching the numbers in that way. It also means not focusing on any certain groups that are being deemed to be having too many kids, or blaming high fertility countries in the global south, or disproportionately focusing on high need areas that tend to be marginalized groups domestically. And yeah, next slide. So what we need is a combination of approaches and solutions to address the impacts of population pressure. So similar to the last slide, this means not perpetuating the false dichotomies of either or thinking that are going to leave out critical parts of the solution. So to we were not actually going to go back, but to reflect on Kelly's slide earlier that gave a breakdown of what people thought was the issue, whether it was population and consumption, just population or just consumption. While the majority of respondents did respond that they believe it's both, there was over 25% that thought it was one or the other. So there's definitely a chunk of people that we still need to be reaching to address that it's kind of all of the above. So again, this means thinking about both. So it's both population growth and focusing on reproductive rights, but also addressing patterns of consumption. Along with this, we also encourage individual and systemic actions. So individual actions are great. We can start implementing them in our everyday lives and they empower us. But there's also systemic changes we advocate for, because things like corporate pollution do have probably greater impact than your mind's impact. And along with this, we don't want to make absolute statements like single largest problem or the only solution. We do realize there's a number of ways to work in this area, and they're all important. Next slide. So comprehensive strategies are going to come up a lot. We need comprehensive strategies that incorporate a justice and rights-based approach from many angles, and we need to be sure we're denouncing any course of policies or rhetoric. So an example of that would be espousing about or dictating the number of children people should have is not the solution. We're not advocating for any policies that encourage that. And that goes from anything as coercive as the previously mentioned one-child policy, forced sterilizations, but we also don't advocate for eliminating tax credits or instituting any kind of tax penalty on people having over a certain number of children. We want long-term holistic solutions that incorporate access to education, healthcare, and voluntary family planning. Next slide. And if we don't talk about population pressures at all, we miss a chance to promote the just and equitable solutions. So dismissing these conversations altogether leaves space for racist and xenophobic ideas that have no place in this movement. So again, that's while people may think it's easier to just avoid that conversation altogether because they think it's complicated or because it's sensitive, it is really important to talk about this in a rights-based way so that these solutions become normalized and they can have the forefront rather than any other xenophobic ones that can come up. Next slide, please. And it's important that we're supporting agency, bodily autonomy, and reproductive justice for people in BIPOC and LGBTQIA+ communities, which face more barriers to reproductive health care. So by correcting the lack of gender inclusivity and equity that often occurs in these conversations, we can ensure equitable access to quality healthcare for everyone. So sometimes what this can look like, this is sort of like a very broad issue altogether, but kind of like the individual ways it can look is somewhat a bit of a disproportionate focus on cis women and the expectation that for them to have sole responsibility of reproductive futures when there are cultural and societal and gender equity barriers. And just not putting all the responsibility on women. Men can be an active participant in family planning conversations as well and taking action themselves. And be sure we're not ignoring LGBTQIA+ parents and children and the unique struggles and discrimination they face when trying to access healthcare. And this can be as simple as don't tell people what to do with their bodies and being sure we are discussing these topics with sensitivity, humility, and respect. Be conscious of the words you're using and their potential meaning to others. Next slide, please. And ultimately, everyone should have the right to have or not have children. Targeting specific groups for any reason denies them reproductive freedom, which everyone should have. So it's important to remember that family planning is a very personal and emotional decision and should be treated with respect. Mandating or recommending contraception or sterilization based on race, income, ability, and education are not good solutions. And these can stoke myths and stereotypes about welfare fraud and other false, harmful ideas about why people have children. So what's important to do instead is to respect everyone's decision and reinforcing the need for equitable healthcare for everyone to be able to make their own choice. Next slide, please. So what now? You want to talk about population, but this was all new to you. It's okay to feel a little bit overwhelmed. This is a process for everyone, but it's one worth sticking with because it's such a critically important issue. And the solutions are straightforward when we help fill the unmet need for contraception with improved access to reproductive healthcare and providing comprehensive and inclusive sex ed. And we can address systemic barriers that make it difficult for all to access reproductive healthcare and to live sustainably. Next slide. And potentially the first step, or kind of a step we can all keep working on, is to better understand and recognize our own unconscious biases. I like this image on this slide because it does a good job of breaking down kind of the mechanisms of unconscious bias. So your brain can be separated into your system 2 and system 1 and system 2 thinking. Your system 1 thinking is fast, unconscious, automatic, everyday decisions but it is error prone. So these are kind of like your split kind of gut instinct, really fast reactions to things. Whereas your system 2 is slow, conscious, effortful, used for complex decisions, and it's more reliable. So part of kind of retraining ourselves when we recognize unconscious biases is just kind of thinking, reflecting, reading more, educating ourselves. And with that, we can start to shift our system 2 thinking and retrain our system 1 thinking. So I just thought that was a helpful way to break that down. And yeah, back to you, Kelly.
Thanks, Sarah. That is such great work both you and Adoma have been doing. So just to wrap up here before we move to Q&A, our goal really is to build people power at both the upstream policy level and downstream individual actions. And our research showed us that people are willing to change their actions and advocate for policy improvement, but generally around 30% need more information. So we're working to improve the language we use in relationship to this work, and we're finding ways to support the anti-racism movement by openly discussing how to have these conversations in an appropriate and sensitive manner. Our goal is to have campaigns rooted in human rights, equity, and empowerment, all of which improve resilience. So we want to leave you with a couple of ways to support this work. First, get involved in your democracy. Urge your congresspeople to support the Global HER Act, which will permanently repeal the global gag rule. And when this is in effect, the policy cuts off funding to those non-governmental organizations that provide abortion counseling or referrals. Support fights for justice, whether that be racial, gender, reproductive, or environmental. Support reproductive rights and education. Look up what family planning access and information is available to you. There's a great website called bedsider.org where you can get this, or Power to Decide. And then you should all be interested in distributing condoms. This is a program that Sarah runs, our Endangered Species Condoms program. And then we urge you to, don't be shy about these discussions. Have the talk about sex and family planning with your partner, with your healthcare provider, or a trusted friend, and help end the carbon economy through renewable energy, a sustainable food system, and by conscious consumption. Because as you've heard us reiterate over and over again, it is both. All right, I know that this is our information here, our names. We are unable to put some things in the chat, but I think Claire and I have figured out a way that we might be able to share some resources in the chat. But anyway, we will move on to Q&A, I think. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your presentation. We have a lot of good questions coming in through the chat. So I'll start out, and Lisa and I will just go back and forth and read them to you guys to answer. So first of all, oops. Do you have any data? Sorry. Do you have any data about the relationship between rape and sexual abuse of women, specifically women with disabilities or in war-torn areas, and pregnancies / population growth?
I don't have any of that data in relationship to population per se, but the underlying issue here is just bodily autonomy, regardless of where you're at and how you get pregnant. So, this is what reproductive freedom, bodily autonomy, and empowerment is all about, that, people should have the choice to decide if and when to get pregnant. I don't know, Sarah, Adoma, if you have anything to add.
All right, our next question says, I wonder how your approach would need to change if there is research published that predicts a collapse of the human population starting this decade due to ecological and climate collapse.
You want to take that one, Sarah? You're the research lit review expert.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think a few papers have come out recently actually already saying that. I don't think our approach changes because we're just trying to get that message out there. So, I mean, I guess it motivates us more, but I don't think anything fundamentally changes for us. We still would be advocating for all of the same goals.
Have you found that separating population planning and education and contraceptives used prior to pregnancy, separating that from abortion or terminating a pregnancy after contraception results in different results and opinions?
My personal opinion on this would be that, it shouldn't be separated because abortion is reproductive health care. And it shouldn't be any more stigmatized or forbidden than the birth control pill or an IUD. It is a reproductive choice that everybody should have. I don't know, Sarah, Adoma, if you... It does get politicized, I mean, it's true. But I think that would be our stance. In fact, the center just recently put out an abortion statement, discussing our support of abortion rights as a reproductive health care. And so, yeah, we're pretty strong in that regard. I know this is Claire. I think for us to put some of these things, these resources in the chat, I think somebody needs to start a question that I could then maybe respond to, because I can't.
Yeah, if you scroll down, Megan Sweeney has a question and you can type the answer to her question.
Oh, fabulous. Sarah, Are you able to help with some of that if together? Okay, thanks. Okay, back at it.
Okay, perfect. Did you have anything else to say about that last question, or do you want to go on to the next one?
I don't know. I think.
All right. Has your organization used the term unsustainable population growth, as the problem is really that human population growth is especially problematic now because the planet can no longer sustain having so many people? So I guess, do you use that language, unsustainable population growth?
Adoma, are you best to answer this, even as it related to the survey?
I can talk about it in relation to the survey. It was certainly a term that came up quite often, or different iterations of qualifiers in front of the term population growth, be it rapid population growth or unchecked population growth. So there is that existing discussion of population growth with the underlying sentiment that the ways in which populations are growing right now are inherently unsustainable.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different adjectives that could go in front of that, whether it's rapid population growth or unsustainable. And I think those are good ideas for us to continue to do some message testing around which adjectives, people are adverse to versus the ones that, they resonate with. So that's a good question. And Adoma and I will make a mental note.
We're also considering how to, in our future work, looking at beyond the use of the term overpopulation, how people respond to these different terms. So that's definitely something that we are keeping on our radar.
Sorry, I just wanted to flag, I answered Megan's question, but I hit answer live first and then typed. So it may have shifted over a category, but it's now been answered.
Our next question is, do you have a strategic plan written to address all of the intensive research here, and how will you engage the general public and educational systems?
Yeah, that is on my to-do list. So, like I said, we just gave you a snippet of the research that we have. And so there's a lot we can do with it, but the intention was to build kind of a handbook that people can use that would help them either one, communicate about this, get clear around all of the nuances of it. But yeah, the intention is, I think, probably to start more with other environmental groups that we could then kind of train the trainer and have them help us go out to the general public. But we do talk to the general public about this also. We like to say that we want to win in the courts, but also in the court of public opinion. So, Sarah and I are constantly writing articles and op-eds and LTEs about this work. So, yeah, it's, but a beautiful holistic plan, I would love that because I am a planner. It's on the list.
Okay, the next question we have is, does your organization actively promote adoption as a way to grow families rather than more births or biological children?
Sarah, you want to take it?
Sure. I mean, like, I don't think we advocate for it like as an organization. Like, we recognize it's can be a good alternative for some families, but with also recognizing there's kind of a lot of organizational and cost barriers, so it's not equally accessible to everyone. So it's not something we just put out there as like, sure, just do that instead. Like, it's not that simple for a lot of reasons.
Okay, we have a few different questions from somebody. So first of all, for the pictures representing the overpopulation consequences, did survey respondents see the captions with the photos? Or did they just see the photos?
They initially had just seen the photos. And as I mentioned before, the themes for the pictures were classified internally, so by our team. And so we associated the pictures with different overarching thematic concepts. And that's actually been a point of future research that we've been really looking at, seeing how people actually visually associate some of these thematic concepts with the actual terms themselves. And that's definitely something that we're considering continuing to explore, because what we might interpret as a good depiction of, let's say, climate change might not always be what other people interpret as a good depiction of climate change. But thank you for asking. Yeah.
And then also from that same person, they were wondering if you would touch on like tax credits for children and maybe what some of the problems or benefits of that is, if anybody wants to talk about that.
Yeah, I can take that question. I think, Sarah mentioned the coercive policies, of course, like, one child policies and things like that. But she did also touch on the idea of tax credits and incentives. And, these, while may not be the traditional kind of coercive policies that you think of, I think many people would say, or people think that they might be pronatalism policies, but the center, while we are not supportive of pronatalism per se, we don't want to see the removal of these policies because, there are children that are receiving support from them that could be harmed if we were to remove the tax credits. And, we get this question a couple times that, I don't have the answer, but I don't know if one is like consciously making this decision that's like, I'm going to have a kid so that I can get this tax credit. Like, I'm just not sure if the thinking is that linear in relationship to it. And so, yeah, that's kind of our stance on that, is that we don't want to see the tax credits removed at this point.
I would just add to that, there are some studies to show that there are really positive benefits from like infant health and like school performance. Like, there's a lot of really positive downstream effects as well. That's really important for quality of life, just as another reason to not get rid of the tax credits.
All right, our next question says, what can really be done to address the unwanted pregnancies? If half of US pregnancies were unplanned, that's a huge chunk, and a lot of kids who will grow up will increase population more.
Yeah, I think, the best way to address unplanned pregnancies is to fulfill the unmet need for contraception. And so in the United States, there are 19 million people that have an unmet need, and most of them are supported through a program called Title X. And this is, a federal program that was started in the 70s under Nixon to support low-income and communities, marginalized communities, to have access to reproductive health care. And, it had been whittled away and attacked under the Trump administration. And so there needs to be a good deal of repair to happen here in the Biden administration to bring back and support Title X, which does promote our safety net clinics that can provide not only access to contraception, but, sex ed and other types of STIs and reproductive health care, cancer screenings. And so, so beyond kind of supporting the unmet need for family planning here domestically, there needs to be kind of a reckoning around our sex ed. And, I'm not going to have the statistics right off the top of my head, but I think it's only 17 states that require a medically accurate comprehensive sex ed. And so, there's a lot of abstinence-only sex ed out there that has been shown to really not prevent pregnancies. And so, that's why we really advocate for both of those. And then, even higher up, let's think a little bit more systemically. Let's have, income equality and gender empowerment, and all of that stuff is going to support women and, birthing people to have fewer children.
Thank you. Next question, do you advocate removing policies that are pronatal and encourage births?
Yeah, this is kind of ties to the one that we just mentioned about the tax credits. So we're not up on every type of pronatalism policy out there. But I think hopefully from the presentation and from the comments so far, we are for any type of policy that supports reproductive autonomy and no coercion. So, but besides the tax credits and incentives, I'm not sure what other policies there are, besides the coercive ones that the center needs to research so that we have an answer.
Next, we have someone asking, are there laws being considered to include/increase reproductive education in schools in the US and elsewhere?
Yeah, so this ties to this comprehensive sex ed. Adoma, Sarah, do either of you have anything to add?
I feel like you can speak best on it.
So we asked this of our survey respondents, and the issue with sex ed is it's super hyper local. So while you might be able to support a state comprehensive sex ed bill, they are generally written such that your local district gets to decide if they want to, support it. And I'm based in Virginia, and there's one right now where they're trying to get comprehensive sex ed at the state level, but yet it would be opt-in at your regional or school superintendent level. So, but I think it's an important place to work. So if people are involved locally, that would be awesome.
Thank you. Next question, if you guys still have time to stay on and answer a few more. Is there value in increasing the cultural acceptance of child-free families or only one-child families?
Sarah, you want to take this one?
Of course. Yeah, there absolutely is. That is something sort of, I think Kelly and I try to do a lot of on like personal one-on-one conversations, is that's, at least me personally, I'm happy to talk about my decision to be child-free, writing about it, talking about it, anything to normalize that conversation and choice. We actually hosted a virtual screening of the movie To Kid or Not to Kid, which is directed by Maxine Trump, and she basically documents her and her partner's decision to do that, among other folks, and kind of the cultural and societal taboos they face. Again, it comes back to reproductive autonomy and trying to get the contraception or potential sterilizations you may want, if that is definitely your permanent decision. So yeah, we're trying to get that stuff out there. And we had a great panel discussion with her and some other folks. So I can potentially find that question and send you a link to that if I got the Q&A. But yeah.
And let me just say here that my email is showing on the screen. So if anybody has any questions that we don't get to or you want more clarity, and we have kind of a list of resources, email me and we will send you that.
One more question. Have you found ways of framing these discussions that can appeal to Catholic and other groups who believe that contraceptive methods other than natural family planning are unacceptable to them? And have you found a way to appeal to these groups?
Yeah, that would be some additional good message testing, Adoma. You know, we get the question about religion a lot. And while we're not really, you know, focused on any type of religion, we just kind of are sharing this information more broadly. There are groups out there that do that. So I know one for sure called Catholics for Choice. And I know the Unitarian Universalists have a sex ed program. Isn't that who it is, Sarah? Adoma's shaking her head.
Yeah.
And yeah, so there are a couple of religions out there. And, you know, while it's often thought of as, you know, they all have this tenet of go forth and multiply, there are some nuances in there in relationship to creationism and, you know, care for earth, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think there's an opportunity for movement building in that regard. And I'm hopeful that we, you know, now have a Catholic president that is very supportive of reproductive rights. So it's a good sign.
Mhm. I would have to agree. And even just from some of the responses in the organizational scan, there are a couple of groups that are really focused on religion but also advocating for comprehensive sexuality education and access to reproductive health care. So it does seem to be like there's like some sort of a shift going on right now, even if it's just in like the very, you know, nascent stages, there is something happening.
Thank you. And I think some people are typing that they're having some trouble seeing the links that you guys sent. If you look at all the answered questions and scroll through them, you should be able to see the answers, I believe. There's a question from Megan Sweeney at 12:45 p.m. And in response to that, there are a lot of links shared. So hopefully people can see those.
Awesome.
And if you'd like to, if you'd like to save the links, you can take a screenshot of them.
Okay, well, if there's anything else from you guys, then we will sign off, I think. And thanks everybody for coming and for all the great questions. That was a great session. And I hope that everybody can make it to PILC panels. We have them all throughout the week. So there should be a brochure for that on all our social media and everything if you haven't yet received it. So thanks everybody for coming, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thanks for having us.
I'm gonna end the webinar now. So everybody have a great day.
Bye.